Oh yeah, coincidences. Hmm? So that's the question with coincidences, because um, when things start to form patterns, when things start to form consistent patterns, then the question of whether these are merely coincidence or not becomes a very pertinent question. It's, things, most things work by pattern in our world. Most things in our world work by pattern. That's a magnet, a North Pole magnet will attract a South Pole magnet, and that's a pattern. That is a fact. It's not a mere coincidence. If I show you all the statistics of how very frequently a North Pole magnet placed in proximity of a South Pole magnet will be attracted to each other, and then you come out and say, oh well, you've just shown that it happens a certain amount of time, and then from that you've drawn this false inference that that it's a pattern. Oh, it's just coincidence. Well, sometimes it's not. Most of the time it's not, because most of the time most things that happen in our world happen for a reason, and those reasons create consistency and patterns. That's why. And people want to go around dismissing consistencies and patterns as mere coincidence. More likely not. Look at the patterns of, for instance, how America enters large wars, or even small wars, but particularly large ones. Look at all the large wars. Let's go back to 1775. That started on the battle. That started on Lexington Common with the Minutemen. Now, there's always remained, in the story of the shot heard round the world, April morning, April 19th, 1775. It's always been on all the historical accountings of the events of that morning. There's always been a huge question mark where nobody could tell who fired that first shot. That first shot that resulted in the volleys that left all the people on both sides dead. They were both sides were standing facing each other with their fingers on the triggers, but waiting, neither side supposedly wanting to be the one to make the first aggressive move. When suddenly, kaboom! Somewhere over people's heads, there was a shot fired, and that all the trigger fingers. That activated all the trigger fingers on both sides, and boom, 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 boom. That one shot started the whole thing, and nobody has been able to verify where that shot came from, whether it came from one of the British soldiers or one of the Americans. Nobody has ever, in the last 240 years, been able to establish or verify. There's no way of knowing, after 240 years, where that first shot was fired from. Alright, I'll leave it at that. Next big war that most of us are familiar with, I'm not that familiar with the 1812 events, but Harper's Ferry, the Civil War. Or was it 1860 or 1861? Harper's Ferry, John Brown on Harper's Ferry, something about trying to blow something up. John Brown was an abolitionist. So somehow, that's why John Brown's body. So that became the rallying theme song for the Union Army, was that, oh, John Brown was such a great martyred hero. Well, when you start to look into the life of John Brown and what kind of a crazy fanatic he was, and all the claims that he made, the statements that he made about how he was going to start a revolution, he was going to force the hand of both sides to start a war because he was fanatical like this, and went and did it. 1898, remember the Maine. San Juan Harbor. The war between America and the so-called Spanish-American War that began in San Juan Harbor, I believe, off the coast of Cuba, began with the blowing up of a United States, was it a Marine ship, I think, called the Maine, that for some reason when we weren't at war with Spain, somehow, some reason this Marine ship was stationed there right outside, right over the, whatever the boundaries with space, what do they call that, ocean space, whatever it is, the technical boundaries where they could be positioned in the water without being accused of violating territorial space. And why this boat was there in the first place when we were supposed to not be at war, and what was going on. And there's a whole story, there's a whole documentaries about the Maine and how it blew up and all the circumstances and all the evidence that's been dug up by researchers since, and including physical evidence brought up by scuba divers that have been able to dive down into the harbor there and pick up physical remains and stuff like that. Very questionable exactly why the Maine blew up, but it really seems to be that it was a false flag. It was a self-inflicted, that somehow whoever was involved was an whoever, it was blown up by America, basically, to make a pretext for us to go to war. A rallying cry, say, oh, these fucking terrorist spics blew up the Maine and we have to go get them. 1898. 1917, now the World War I started in 1914, but we were supposed to be neutral. We were supposed to be staying out of that European conflict for 3 years. But then in 1917, the Lusitania got sunk. Now, the Lusitania was supposedly a passenger, like a cruise, what do they call those Norwegian, a transatlantic cruise ship. This was before they had airplanes going across the Atlantic. You couldn't have taken an airplane. There was no airline you could have gotten a ticket on to cross the Atlantic. You had to go by boat, and it was shot down by a German, a U-boat, I think. They torpedoed the Lusitania, and that's what brought America into World War I. But there's a lot of claims that, in fact, the whole thing was, we were supposed to be so outraged that it was a civilian ship that was shot down by these horrible, the Huns. That's what the Germans would refer to as the Huns in World War I. The horrible Huns, or the Bosch, or the Krauts, shot down innocent civilians in the Lusitania. But there's a lot of the other theories that, in fact, Lusitania was carrying weapons to England, and that those people responsible for it, that was carrying weapons concealed under the guise of being a cruise ship with civilians, which it had civilians, but it was also carrying weaponry to England. And supposedly this had been deliberately leaked, or in the Morse code messages, they deliberately leaked the information that there were weapons on the Lusitania in order to goad the Germans into destroying the Lusitania, and it worked. And the civilians were there to provide the convenient rallying cry and all of that, to get Americans all worked up about how we have to go get back at those Huns, those evil Huns. Does that sound familiar? 2001, 3,000 people in the World Trade Center buildings. Now, those World Trade Center buildings had like 100,000 people that worked in them every day. And yet, with both of those towers being totally demolished, only 3,000 people died. That's pretty amazing. That's a pretty amazingly low number of casualties, considering the extent of the number of people that worked every day in those buildings. Only 3,000 was pretty amazing, and I noticed that very first day. Because when the very first reports of the planes crashing into those towers came out, the first reports, this is like 9:30 in the morning, 9:15, 9:30, no, it was a little after 9:30, 9:45 or 10:30 in the morning of September 11th, 2000, which is almost the 11th anniversary, 2001. In a few days it will be what is today? Today is September 8th. On that very morning, the reports about it were saying, there's at least 50,000 people working in each building, and the death toll is likely to be incredibly immense. And I didn't tune in the rest of the day. I didn't want to hear how many had died, because I imagined it was going to be at least 30,000 people. I imagined it was going to be about 30 to 60,000 people would have died from the complete destruction of those two buildings, and it only turned out to be 3,000. That was one of the first things that made me say, wait a second, that's something that struck me as a little bit peculiar, that only 3,000, that it was that small of a number out of the huge number of people that had to be evacuated from those buildings in a very, very short span of time. But that's what they served, the same purpose that the passengers of the Lusitania, so that America could say, oh, those horrible, evil, inhuman terrorists, now we have to go and get them back. So then there's World War II, okay? Pearl Harbor. Pearl Harbor, how similar is that to San Juan Harbor? Pearl Harbor was in Hawaii, which was not a U.S. state at the time. I suppose it was a U.S. territory, but it was not a state. There were only 48 states in 1941. Alaska was not a state. Hawaii was not a state. Pearl Harbor was situated in Hawaii, and it was full of American warships, American military. And it's been it's been proposed by people who study this stuff that in fact there was a build-up in Pearl Harbor deliberately done out in the open to make it obvious, to deliberately goad the Japanese into attacking us, because they knew that sort of attack, that sort of a martyrdom event was what was needed again as a rallying cry for Americans to say, oh my God, those evil terrorist foreigners, those fucking nips, we've got to go show them and get them back for what they did to our innocent civilians. They weren't innocent. Most of them were not civilians in Pearl Harbor. They were military personnel that died there. Vietnam, 1964, the Gulf of Tonkin. Again, another very similar warship getting blown up, and they claimed that it was the Vietnamese who blew it up, but there's people that have studied this and say that no, the Vietnamese did not, it could not have blown this up. The only people who could have done it was the Americans themselves, and it was again done as this pretext to drag us into the war. It's a constant pattern. These are not, when patterns are consistent, they stop being coincidental, and they start to be indications that there are similar behaviors continuing and continuing and continuing over and over and over. So what made me think of that? I'm going to stop because my audio keeps breaking out. But I'm going to make a part 2 to this video, because every time this goes a little too long, I lose my audio, and that sucks. I'm sitting there talking for 10 minutes and it's blank. But the next part 2 is all about the patterns of the election and what happened in my town 3 years ago in 2009. Patterns.